Now, back in the time of early America, at its humble beginnings, here's a map of what it looked like just after the Revolutionary War, and all the territories, the 13 colonies, and the new territories to be explored. This was a real beautiful country, so vast, so unexplored by the settlers. It was home to the Native Americans, and they'd been here thousands upon thousands of years before any settler set foot in here. And here's the Appalachian Mountains down the eastern coast of America. It was an impregnable wall at the time, and the settlers come from the coast and up against this. As time went on, time and the land, they started expanding out. But this was reserved for the Indians a long time back before the Revolutionary War, and this was all Native Americans' land. Now, most come from over Europe and a lot of other different places, not just Europe, but most were Scotch-Irish, English, Germany, all just in here, but most were Scotch-Irish. And they just come into the new land because they was troublemakers or just wanted more freedom and whatever. So they got into this country and they settled on the East Coast. Well, all the land was tied up, so they wanted land to themselves, but all was left was in these rugged mountains. And by the time usually they got here, in the late 1700s, Daniel Boone had already blazed a trail in 1775, the Wilderness Road through Cumberland Gap. And a lot of settlers started traveling this road looking for new land. And here's a map of the Wilderness Road as it comes out of the east down the Shenandoah Valley, and it splits off and forks off all down through this pioneer country. Vast wilderness, untouched by settlers. And they come in here by little wagons, a little bit here and a little bit there, trying to find land and set them up a homestead so they could raise their family, start their own little farm. But as time went on, they had to travel in groups because the Indian problem. Now, they set up in this old wilderness here, just trying to cut something out of the wilderness just to build a home, a log cabin, anything that could start building them a home and start farming and raising their family. And they started out with stuff like this. This is just a simple cabin. This is one of the better ones though. This is a 2-story. And all up and down this pioneer frontier, stuff like this was being set up. And they were always being watched by the Native Americans. Most were friendly, tried to get along and share, but some were not. And they didn't like the white man encroaching on their land, so there was trouble here and there, both sides. Atrocities happened on both sides. And most little communities had a fort they could go to they'd built, so when they had Indian problems, they'd all just gather up and stay in the forts until everything settled down and died down, and they'd go back to their farms. Now, back in them days, it was kill or be killed on the frontier. That's the way it was. People didn't like it, but that was the way it was. Kill or be killed. And a lot of atrocities, like I said, happened on both sides, not just one side. And when things died down, they went back to building their cabins. Here's how they built them. This is the style of what they started out with, just logs. And there's usually manpower. One group of people would help. The families would all gather up together and build a cabin, and then they would go build another one for the other ones. And there wasn't no shortage of wood. They'd take their mule or horse and cut a tree down, drag it down out of the woods there where they could shape it up there for their log cabin they was building. So there was no shortage of wood at that time. And they used simple tools like this. Just little hand tools, manual labor. all by hand. Here's some of the old tools that they used to use. Hard work, back-breaking work, but they built all their homes with tools like this with the help of an old trusty mule. And like I said, they done it all by hand. They were craftsmen back in them days. It was slow manual labor, but they was good at it. They were craftsmen. Now here's the kind of joints they usually made on just regular logs. Starting out, they'd notch them where they overlapped, set down into each other to keep the gap down in between the logs as much as they could. They wouldn't have to fill it with so much mud and stuff. And as time went on, they got little sawmills set up here and there back in the old days, and they'd start cutting their own wood. They'd saw it up for them. And most of it come off of their land, or they'd trade for the wood, or whatever they had to do. And here's the kind of joints they made. Now you could tell some were still made by hand, but some you could tell by the sides of it they was cut by a sawmill or notched with a tool. But that's the joints they made. And they still make these joints today. A good example is a good website you can go to, YouTube, The Bearded Carpenter. He does a really fine job at making these cabins. He works on them all the time in his videos. He does a really good job. Now here's the kind of old cabins they had back in them days. After the logs was gone, they started using timbers. All styles, handmade, notched piece by piece. Here's an old cabin here. You see how the design is. And I noticed in this old picture here of this cabin, there's a little girl, bless her heart, hiding right behind the edge of this cabin. The hard times she's seen. I don't know how old this picture is, but it's way back in the 1800s. Now these old people in these mountains, they live hard, they worked hard, and they settled in this wild country, and they lived off the game, and they made everything by hand. If they couldn't make it, they'd trade for it, or they'd do without. That's just the way these mountain people was, and still are today. And you could see the hard life they had trying to raise a family in these old wilderness country. These were true pioneers. It's before anything. No stores, no nothing. And they done everything by hand. Neighbor helping neighbor. That was what they depended on. And a lot of times they didn't have that. And all these little old cabins had a little cellar out back where they stored their goods and stuff. Or an old smokehouse. And these old people, they were true pioneers, and they were proud of it. And they worked this old land. Didn't matter what kind of piece of ground they had, they worked it. On a hillside, river bottom, rocky side, it didn't matter. That's what they done, and they worked it hard too. And they canned everything. When canning or jars come available, they started canning back in the 1800s. And they stored up everything in these little old back buildings here, cellars. Here's some of the old pictures of some of the old pioneers when they first settled this country. These people lived hard. You either got out and made it or you starved to death. And these poor women, the pioneer women, they worked hard as a man did, and they had a lot of responsibility on raising these families, keeping the family going, and they lived hard. No doctors, no hospitals, no midwives, just that's all they have is midwives. But these people were comfortable. They didn't have no money. They didn't know no different. They was comfortable, and they raised what they had to have, or they traded for it, or they made it. Here's the kind of kitchens they had at first in these old cabins and buildings. Nothing extravagant, but it got them by, it fed them. And for transportation, it was for an old truck, it was no buckboard or wagon or a pack of mules or an old horse. Now these people, they wasn't afraid of nothing or nobody. And they believed in what they believed in, and they fought for it too. And they tried to pass this on down to their kids and their grandkids and so on. They taught them the Bible, how to read and write, what few of them could read and write. And they passed down their ways of doing things and their style of life. Sad thing is, these little pioneer graveyards that's forgotten about in the middle of nowhere are full of little old babies. There was no doctors, no hospitals, just midwives, and some of them didn't stand a chance. And a lot of pioneers is buried in these old graveyards. Here's one from back when he fought with John Sevier with the Battle of Kings Mountain during the Revolutionary War. And then a month later, he fought in Sevier County in Boyd's Creek on an Indian raid. But this is here Sharp's Chapel at Lost Creek. Some real pioneers. Now these old houses, they're just about gone, but this is in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They've preserved a lot of these old cabins, these old pioneer homes, you can see here. So beautiful. But you think about how hard of times these people had. No electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing, but they made it just fine, and they raised big families too. Beautiful old homes of the past. And these were probably some of the better homes of the day at that time. Little homesteads, little farms. But that's gone by now. And if you head back in these old mountains, it don't matter what state you're in these Appalachians. You head back in these old mountains, back behind these hollers and stuff, and these old pioneers, you can still see traces of where they once struggled to make a living. All you'll see is stuff like this. A lot of times it's just a pile of rocks. The chimneys collapsed. But these old people lived hard in these mountains. These were the true pioneers. They settled this country. They made it what it is today. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of history. I know I love showing it to you. So I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.